So this session is about sort of partly the historical trends on social mobility, but also I think we're going to get into a bit of debate about the prospects for mobility as well and some of the drivers for mobility. It's a real coup to have these experts around the table. I think they cover pretty much every aspect of social mobility, however defined. And I'm going to urge my panelists to be really clear on how you define social mobility, because I think that this is something that we'll get into, whether it's relative, absolute, et cetera, because I think that will make the discussion better. But just, I'll introduce everyone and then we'll open it up to Steve to speak. But just to say who these great experts are: Steve Machin here to my side, Professor of Economics and Director of the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics, Fellow of the British Academy, of course, famous now with Joe Blannon, who's also here for publishing the 2005 Sutton Trust study on social mobility. He does many more things than that, and I've realised over the years. He's one of the world's, I would say, leading labour economists. I hope that's not too strong a claim, Steve. So that's Steve. Then we have Anna Vignoles, who's Professor of Education, Director of Research at the Faculty of Education, is one of the most prolific professors that I know, and has done a huge amount.
I'm worried now.
A huge amount, I think, on every aspect of educational inequality that I can think of, and also is on the Sutton Trust Education Advisory Group, and was on the EF. I don't know how you managed to do all these things on the EF Evaluation Advisory Group as well. And then to my right we have Selina Todd, who is the Professor of Modern History at Oxford University, also the President of the Socialist Education Association. And I just wanted to mention Selina's book, The Rise and the Fall of the Working Class, which is out now in paperback. Caitlin Moran's one of Caitlin Moran's cultural highlights. I was just saying how impressive it was to get that. And I just have to read this quote. It was brilliant. The history is one of anger, defiance, and sometimes of despair, but ultimately of hope for a better future, one that we can build by knowing more about how ordinary people change things for the better, usually with no help whatsoever from the privileged, wealthy few. Sorry, I just had to read that. So that's Selina. And then, of course, we have John Goldthorpe to my far right. And John was official fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford, from 1969 to 2002. He's now an emeritus fellow there. He's a fellow of the British Academy. He wrote a very famous book, The Constant Flux, Class Mobility in Industrial Societies, which I'll say is one of the classic sort of books in social mobility. He's also produced the famous Goldthorpe class schema, which I know many of you will know about, among many, many other things. He's also the only researcher that Sutton Trust has ever known to actually give back the money that we gave to him for a grant. So we asked John to look into accents and social. Do you remember this? And I think it was a few months later, you basically sent the money back and said, sorry, we haven't found a way of doing this. So I think that's the first and only time an academic has given us money back. So what we're going to do is Steve's going to speak for 15, 20 minutes, roughly, so slides, and then the three panelists are going to respond for 6 minutes each. They've negotiated with me for an extra minute each. But Steve, do you want to start? Thank you.
So I should first say thanks for inviting me. I'm very keen to be on this highly esteemed panel, I think, and I hope it's going to be fun and interesting what we talk about, and also have a lot of relevance for debates about social mobility. So one of the things Justin Green emphasised this morning was place, and have people who are different you have different people coming from the same place. So I'm actually from the same place as Caitlin Moran, if people know where she's from. The other thing is, we were talking about technology and automation before, and I'm amazed to pick this thing up, which is the flicker for the slides. You know, we normally have these very small little flickers and stuff, and so I thought this looked like something kind of from a 1980s science fiction film or something. You know, it's just back and next, and everybody else will see it when we're sitting. But I've just looked up, and it's from a company called Interspace Industries, which is a great name, I think, as well. I've just looked them up. It's very, very modern, this, so I'm obviously completely out of date. Or either that or I've been watching too many 1980s science fiction films. Okay, right. Anyway, so the brief here was to talk about social mobility over time, and that's what I'm going to do. And so the focus I want to place a focus on three particular questions, given a brief about what's happened to social mobility over time. So what I first want to talk about is something that's been mentioned so far. I'm sure we'll have a lot more discussion about this, and on which there's been a debate, a lot of which was kicked off actually from from the Sutton Trust report that we wrote and the academic article that went with that, which was published in whenever it was, 2005. So what I wanted to do is just talk about some of that stuff, and I also to also kind of say a little bit about where the debate's gone, the academic debate's gone, and talk a bit about more recent evidence as well. The second thing I want to talk about is what's been happening in the labour market more recently, and I think this has actually radical implications in terms of what's been going on in terms of social mobility, because the real wage falls that have been occurring, not just real wage stagnation, the real wage falls that have been occurring in the UK labour market have quite a lot of significance in terms of how people are doing in terms of earnings relative to their parents. And then the third thing I want to talk about, which has all been alluded to at various times in terms of some of the questions from the previous two sessions, is I wanted to just have a little bit of a discussion about the relative emphasis that's placed on different policy goals that are aimed at enhancing social mobility. So we've had a lot about education, and I want to talk a little bit about the credibility and the relative emphasis that one might want to place on certain drivers of social mobility, which of course are the things that policy can affect. Okay, right, so social mobility over time. I've deliberately put controversy in inverted commas here, and there's been a kind of supposed controversy, I think, about this in the academic literature. I'm not sure it's very controversial myself. And you saw the chart that was put up earlier on about long-run trends in relative and absolute social mobility, and the apparent differences depending on what measure you might want to use. So if you've got some measure Y for parents and children when they become adults, one thing we might assess about the extent of mobility or immobility in terms of intergenerational mobility would be what the correlation is between those, the parental measures and the children's measures. And so there's quite a lot of literature that's looked at this. These aren't the only measures in the intergenerational literature, but the two that have received the big degree of attention in the social mobility literature are whether one looks at earnings and income or whether one looks at social class measures, largely based on very broad occupational categories. And so you might want to look at whether people from high income backgrounds are themselves high income, or you might want to look at people from high social classes or low social classes, whether they themselves are high social class or lower social class. So you kind of want to look at the origin destination kind of associations. And when you do this, it's sort of interesting because you get what this apparent controversy. Because if you look at what happened across the two birth cohorts that we studied in this early work, you actually see that the extent of intergenerational mobility in earnings and income falls over time. So there's an episode where across the two cohorts that were studied, you see a strengthening of the relationship between parents' income and children's earnings, i.e. reduced social mobility. If you look at big social class, which John and many co-authors have looked at for some time, over that same time period, you don't see that changes at all. It's pretty flat. Okay. So that's kind of where because we had this kind of supposed controversy, and people were saying, and people were pitching this as economists and sociologists don't agree yet again on these kind of things. I think that's a complete red herring, actually, because I think the controversy is very easily reconciled. And actually, if you look at more recent studies, I think they reconcile them. And if you think about economic theory, you can reconcile them quite straightforwardly. The first thing is at the same time as social mobility fell, labour market inequality, earnings inequality rose very sharply. So the distribution of earnings became wider over time as the labour market reacted to things like technical change and globalisation, which benefited more skilled workers and were detrimental to the earnings and incomes of less skilled workers. And so you have a wider distribution now. So of course, if you actually want to move up one place in that distribution, you have to go further. And so there's a mechanical relationship between higher inequality and lower social mobility, which lies behind the kind of income correlations that you see. So earnings inequality is wider, so people have to move up. To move up, you have to travel more in terms of pounds to move up, or dollars in the US, to move up one place in the distribution. What's also true, there's more recent work in sociology There's a very nice paper by Lawrenson and Friedman that's just coming out in the American Journal of Sociology, one of the leading journals in sociology, where they look at small social class measures rather than the big social class measures. So John's measures are big, broad measures like professional classes, managerial classes, skilled, unskilled, semi-skilled, manuals and so on. These guys look at much, much more detailed social class categories. And actually they find out that occupational shifts occur within the big social classes. So there's actually an increased variance of the jobs that are present in the big social classes. What's also true is that these observations in 1 and 2, I've just said, arise because basically inequality rises within the big social class groups over time. So there's more income inequality amongst professionals, there's more income inequality amongst semi-skilled manuals than there was in the past. And so that's, of course, why you see the differences between the big social class and the income inequality measures. Mike Savage, another sociologist, has also done some very interesting work on super elites and people at the top, and showing how the top has become much stickier in terms of people staying at the top and not dropping down as compared to before, which of course is also consistent with social mobility falling over time. So I don't think there's any big controversy here. I actually think, you can actually, these two findings are completely fine. They stand together, they're both correct, and there's no issues of interpretation, particularly with those. You might, from a policy lever, you might be more interested in affecting earnings rather than the jobs that people are going into, the broad classes of jobs that people are going into because of this, because there's been a decline in social mobility according to earnings. So I think this reconciliation is fine. I've just said it, and it also makes it clear why the UK has always been pretty low in the International League table. John's work has confirmed this for a long time. We also have some new evidence based on a different measure of economic and social status, home ownership, where we also show there's a fall in social mobility because of home ownership becoming more strongly associated in the recent past than before that. So of course, home ownership for people of for people of working age, housing wealth is easily their biggest component of wealth. So of course we can say something about wealth mobility with this. Of course, if you put pensions in, then pension wealth is also a big component. But for people of working age who haven't retired yet, then housing wealth is their biggest component of total wealth. So actually, if you look at the correlations across the 1958 and 1970 cohort, this is now when people are aged 42, so this is very recent evidence. So 58 cohort, the National Child Development Study, the left-hand, so it doesn't have a highlighter, I don't think. So it's not. So it is technologically deficient, actually. So the left-hand chart shows you the NCDS, people aged 42 in the year 2000, and the right-hand panel of that one shows you people aged 42 in 2012. And the two bars are whether your parents owned their own home at age 16 as well. And so what you see is you see it dropping across the two cohorts, which we know has happened because we know home ownership, particularly amongst the young, which is going to be on this second chart over here, has occurred. But you actually see a very, very sharp fall going from 74% to 59% in terms of home ownership rates for people whose parents did not own their own home at age 16. And so you can see that you see a strengthening of the relationship between parents' home ownership and children's home ownership, which is again is a sign of falling social mobility. This is big, in terms of what's been going over time. And so when I come to the next part of the talk, I'm going to talk about generational changes a bit more. But you can see the younger really losing out here. So this shows you, the right-hand thing here shows you from the Survey of English Housing for part of it, which became the English Housing Survey for the second part of it. Subtle distinction. You can see home ownership rates for people aged 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, up to 60 to 69 in 4 years. 1993 is the light grey bar, going up to 2013, which is the black bar. And you can see that basically in the older groups, certainly the 50s and the 60s, you see not that much difference across the years. But you see the black bar continually falling and falling massively when you go down into the 20s. So only 20% of the 20 to 29-year-olds are homeowners in 2013, whereas 50% of them were back in 1993. We think a key driver of that is whether you owned your own home, whether you grew up in an owner-occupation situation when you were young. It's also true that if you kind of run a statistical regression and put in of a probability of home ownership for the cohort members, the strongest predictor, over and above income or social class, the strongest predictor is whether your parents themselves owned their own home when you were age 16. So we think this adds an extra dimension to the notion that social mobility fell. It's not looking back in the 80s and 90s, it's looking right up to date in the 2000s. Those changes are between 2000 and 2012, and it's very stark how much it falls, but how much the home ownership rates fall. So that was, of course, about relative mobility. All of that was about relative mobility. In terms of relative mobility, that's the stuff that if somebody goes up, somebody else has to go down. So, of course, absolute mobility is of significant interest as well. And probably in the period when we saw the episode of falling social mobility in terms of earnings and income, this probably wasn't that dramatically bad, certainly compared to what's going on in other countries, because real wages were actually growing then. So people were earning more than inflation and getting better off over that time period as well. Recent changes in the labour market, though, make this very significant what's going on now. Because we've actually seen a worsening of absolute income mobility in the last 10, 15 years when real wages have not grown at all. So we've got recent trends of real wage stagnation and indeed in Britain falling real wages. And these have happened across the board, but they've also happened more for some groups of workers than for others. So these two charts kind of show you two things that have been going on. So the left-hand chart here is median real weekly wages between 1980 and 2016 from the best data source we've got, which is the annual survey of hours and earnings, which is an employer-reported survey of 1% of the entire employed workforce. And if your last two national insurance digits are the same, you're in there. And so your employer has to report your earnings to the survey. So you can see basically, if you look at that figure on the left, there's really three periods of interest. So it turns out that if you go from 1980 to about the mid-2000s, you see on average 2% real wage growth each year. Okay, so real wages were growing by about 2%. Then at some point in the mid-2000s, this slows down. Importantly, before 2008, it slows down, and then it goes off a cliff in 2008 when the financial crisis hit, and real wages fall a lot. So what this chart on the right-hand side here does is focuses in on particular groups by age since 2008. So we're indexed at 1 in 2008, and so you can see the scale of the real wage falls. For most of these ages at the top here, it falls by somewhere. They fall by real wages actually fall by about 5 to 8%, but they fall much more markedly amongst the young. So the young are doing really badly in terms of their real wages. In one of the questions earlier, I said that actually if you look at people with age less than 24, they're now entering the labour market. Even though if you look back on the chart on the left, real wages were growing pretty healthily back in 1997. The young are now entering the labour market at the same levels as people were. 18 to 24-year-olds are paid exactly the same now as 18 to 24-year-olds were back in 1997. So there's no progress at all. So they're making no progress relative to their parents. They're making no progress. So absolute mobility is actually falling now in Britain. Okay? If you just want to think about this internationally, this chart shows you where the UK real wage position is compared to 25 other countries. And you can see the one from the second to the left there with the significant real wage falls between 2007 and 2015 is the UK. Only Greece is worse. And there's plenty of countries that are doing much better. So not only are real wages falling, we're also falling far behind international competitors in terms of wages in real terms as well. Okay, so there's a very big warning sign that you might want to think about here, about why these recent trends might matter a lot. We might compare with what's happened in the US. So in the US, median real wages have not grown since 1979. So the median is actually pretty much dead flat. It's possibly fallen a little bit for men and grown a little bit for women who are doing better in the labour market. So the left-hand side shows you that same UK chart. where real wage growth is reasonably healthy. I mean, the dotted line shows you what's been going on in the US, where the median is really flat. So, of course, if you think about people at the median now relative to where their parents were in the US, they're coming in at lower wages than their parents were earning when they were entering the labour market. So this chart over here is from a science article that's recently been published by Larry Katz and Alan Kruger, showing two things. What's happened to absolute mobility in the US as wages have completely stagnated? And so you see absolute mobility falling massively. That's the left axis. The right axis is a very interesting measure, which is how the gap between children's earnings and parents' earnings. So over here, we're currently producing a chart like this for the UK, which we haven't done yet. It won't come down all the time. It will actually be improving a little bit to start with, but then it will go off a cliff at the end, worse than that does as well. So absolute mobility is actually falling in Britain. I think this puts an actual much bigger spin on the importance for policy here. But actually, in the past, it used to be that relative mobility was not very high and probably fell. But we had absolute mobility as people's wages were growing in the labour market. We haven't got that anymore. We haven't had that for about 15 years now. Okay, so let me just end with just a few observations about things. It is a rather strange. It's either it is rather strange or it is a rather strange thing to think of social mobility, which is the outcome of many, many factors and experiences that people have, their individuals and their families have, as a kind of policy goal in and of itself. Maybe that's obvious, but some of the debate, certainly some of the media debate, doesn't seem to see that. It talks about social mobility policy all the time. It's actually the drivers of social mobility that are actually the key thing that policy should be engaged with. And I think we need to have better models of how these drivers work for understanding how policy might be able to actually improve social mobility. I don't think we have very good models at all at the moment. People speculate wildly about this affects social mobility, that affects social mobility, without any models or any real way of thinking about that. And what we obviously need to do is to improve the equalising impact of any of these drivers for the social mobility position. It seems that the key issues, the key main issues, they're not the only ones, although you can think of these very broadly, are educational inequalities, which we've had a lot about today, and labour market inequalities. Remember, the parents of the children who are currently at school are in the labour market. They're in the labour market for a lot longer than their kids are at school. And so actually we might want to think about labour market policy as well. And so I think we need to be clear and get it right on how educational and labour market inequalities connect to falling social mobility. And I think we've got to be really clear about this. Education has completely failed in its way so far. Education has not been the great leveller. If anything, it's either done nothing, as John might actually say, or it's actually to reinforce already existent inequalities. And it's actually been disequalising. The expansion of HE clearly benefited people from richer families on average, and that's one of the reasons why social mobility fell and developed a stronger relationship, because if you've got a degree as well, then that generates you a stronger relationship with your parents' earnings than it did before. And I think people really need to put their hands up on this and realise the experience we've had so far is actually that education has caused social mobility to fall. It hasn't done anything on average to actually improve social mobility at all. My particular view as well, of course education potentially matters and could be equalising, it just hasn't been. It's been disequalising and has actually reduced social mobility. And the balancing debate, policy debates, to my liking as well, has been much too skewed towards education rather than the labour market. And within the education debates has been much too skewed towards elite education. How do we get many more people to Oxford and Cambridge? All of my panel here are from Oxford and Cambridge. How do we get more people who look like these people here?
LSE isn't really that.
It's not, no. I take the points. But I think we need to kind of think very carefully about this. And the labour market side of things, I think, is very important. And actually, if we can boost people's earnings such that they are not experiencing real wage falls, that's beneficial for them, and it should be beneficial for their children as well. Okay. So I think we need to think about that. So just to conclude, I think social mobility, however measured, I think people pretty much agree that social mobility, the level of social mobility in Britain, is now and has been for quite some time pretty low. It's certainly much, much lower than many of our international competitors. And it's very, very low compared to the Scandinavian countries. But, countries like Germany, Canada have much more social mobility. Australia has much more social mobility than Britain does. On the educational inequality side, there's been some minor improvements in school outcomes. But if you think about them in terms of a big picture, they're not really that important. And arguably, the idea that GCSE results are not so dependent on family income now is actually potentially just because we've got ceiling effects because of how many people get GCSEs anyway, and it has to fall anyway. Irrespective of that, people have moved on to the next stage. I've got mentioned about the education arms race here. We know that as in terms of all the expansion of education that we've seen in the post-war period, what seems to happen is, to start with, you didn't have many people who stayed on after the compulsory school leaving age. And then actually as people started catching up and more people went beyond and more people stayed on, actually people from richer backgrounds went to the next stage, which is going to university. Once people start catching up, and as they did do in the early 1990s when we have the big HE expansion, it then mattered which university you go to. So you go to the elite universities, and so the richer people tend to do that more. And indeed now go on to get postgraduate qualifications as well. You know, if you actually look at the percent in the workforce who've got a postgraduate qualification now, it's an astonishing number. It's about 12%, which is an amazing number, actually, if you think about 12% of the workforce have got postgraduate qualifications. Okay, now this issue about minor improvements in school outcomes is kind of a bit worrying when you look at the other side of things. But actually completed education doesn't seem to be improving very much. The OECD's PIAC results showed that there was only 2 countries out of, I think it's 26, is it? I can't quite remember exactly how many. It's about 26 countries in PIAC. There's only 2 countries that have one feature in terms of their literacy and numeracy skills of the adults who take part in the survey, about the young not doing any better than the old. If it is 26, in 24 countries, younger people, aged 16 to 24, do better than older people on the literacy and numeracy tests. Only in Britain and America are the young just as bad as the old in terms of being defined functionally illiterate and functionally innumerate. These 16 to 24-year-olds, of course, it's 2012 the survey took place. So some of them have just left school. Some of them might still be in school. But they're the ones who, you know, were going to school during the 2000s when these minor improvements occurred. Yet, if you look at their poor literacy and numeracy distributions, completed education doesn't seem to be any better. Then what else is going on? The education arms race, I've already said that. Oh, and then was also, notwithstanding those issues about falling real wages being more pronounced for the young, there was also the rise of insecure work arrangements and many jobs now that seem to have a complete lack of career development. Many of the gig economy jobs that people are doing now, it's better that they're doing them rather than being unemployed, because they're getting some experience in work, but they don't seem to have any path to any future career development at all. And there's a much higher incidence of people doing these sorts of jobs amongst the young, who I've already said absolute mobility is falling for. So I'm afraid I have to end on a rather bleak, we could put bleak prospects up the top there. I have to end up in a rather bleak position and emphasise the need for something to be done to improve social mobility. And that has to be done by trying to tackle the drivers of social mobility, but not in a kind of half-hearted way. I mean, I suppose one of the things about elite education is, you know, there's been not enough emphasis on vocational education really delivering, and people might say, oh no, not that old chestnut, it never worked in the past, it doesn't do anything. That's because it's never been tried properly in the past, it's never been properly funded in the past. I mean, a commitment to doing that actually needs to be very important. So one interesting thing in the labour market, of course, is the apprenticeship levy, which is a good thing, and that's actually encouraging employers to take on apprentices, but it's not very widespread. I actually think some more of those kind of things would actually be particularly important for trying to battle the trend down in social mobility. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much.